Athens. Midday. The sun is so hot that even the marble seems to be burning. A strange figure emerges from the crowd in the agora. A thin man in an old cloak walks with a lantern in his hand. People laugh. After all, the square is already flooded with light. He stops, raises the lantern higher, and says, "I am looking for an honest man." We know about this episode thanks to Diogenes Laertius, a biographer of philosophers who lived several centuries after the events. Historians note that some of these anecdotes may have been exaggerated, but it is they who created the legend of Diogenes. In a city where every hunter chases gold, fame, or power, these words sound like a challenge. For who is more numerous here, wise men or merchants of lies? It was Diogenes. A man who turned his own life into a theater of denunciation. He lived in a barrel, but his laughter and gestures made kings tremble and philosophers blush. A rhetorical question: what is more frightening for society, war, which destroys walls, or laughter, which destroys hypocrisy? Today we will tell the story of someone who turned philosophy into a weapon of mockery. About a man who showed that to be free is to have nothing but the right to laugh at all the rules. Imagine Athens at that time. A city that was called the heart of culture and democracy. Here, theaters were built, tragedies were written, and orators competed. Here, words could be stronger than swords. During the day, the market was bustling in the agora, fishermen shouted as they hauled in their catch, merchants from Asia Minor displayed their fabrics, philosophers argued about the meaning of life under the plane trees. And at night, the city changed. In the darkness of the lanterns, banquets, lavish feasts, loud songs, and debauchery began. The streets, where virtue and wisdom were discussed during the day, turned into a fairground of debauchery at night, a contrast that challenged any idea of a moral Athens. Athens was both a temple of wisdom and a fairground of pleasures. This was the duality of Athens: during the day, the cult of beauty, theater, and philosophy; at night, debauchery and banquets. And that is why the Athenians perceived the appearance of a philosopher who lived in a barrel and ate raw meat as a personal insult. He undermined their myth of the ideal city. Philosophy here had long since become not only a search for truth, but also a fashion. The students of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, each opened their own school, each drew listeners to their side. It was not only a spiritual struggle, but also a competition for prestige. Being a student of the right school meant status, respect, and access to a circle of influential people. In such a world, where philosophy often became an ornament rather than a way of life, a stranger appeared. A man who rejected all these rules. He did not give lectures in the shade of colonnades, did not organize schools, and did not seek students. He simply lived, so that his very life became a lesson. Everyone knew the name of this stranger. He did not need a chair to make the city talk about him. Because when everyone wanted to look wise, he decided to show that wisdom begins with something simple: the rejection of hypocrisy. That was Diogenes. Diogenes was born far from Athens, in the city of Sinope on the Black Sea coast. His father worked at the mint, and it was there that the story began that forever ruined the family's reputation. He was accused of counterfeiting money. Legend has it that the young Diogenes took this incident as a sign. If the world around him lived in lies, why not remint not coins, but society as a whole? Instead of gold and silver, he decided to test the strength of human values themselves. Eventually, he left Sinope and went to Athens. There he met Antisthenes, a student of Socrates himself. Antisthenes taught that happiness lies not in wealth or fame, but in freedom from desires. But even his lessons seemed too soft to Diogenes. He demanded a radical life, not just talk. Thus began his transformation. He rejected everything: money, home, habits. He rejected money, home, and habits. He decided to live as simply as possible, stripping away everything superfluous and artificial. From that moment on, he was no longer just an exile from Sinope. He became a living challenge to Athens. People could ignore his words, but they could not turn away from his way of life. This is where the legend of Diogenes began, the philosopher who decided that the best sermon was not words, but his own existence. When most Athenians were building houses with columns, Diogenes chose a home that would only be suitable for storing grain or wine. He settled in a large clay amphora in the central square. For him, it was not a joke or a temporary shelter, but a principle. He slept on the ground, without a bed or blanket. He ate whatever he could find. He often chewed raw meat to show that civilization, with its cooks and seasonings, was nothing more than a luxury illusion. He relieved himself publicly and demonstratively to break taboos and force the Athenians to look at things they themselves hid. The Athenians were shocked. Some spat and turned away, calling him crazy. Others, on the contrary, came to watch, as if at the theater. Does he really live like this, or is it just a performance? But that was exactly what he wanted. His life became a mirror in which society saw its own hypocrisy. After all, everyone knew that they also ate, drank, and relieved themselves, but pretended that it was shameful. He broke this convention. Diogenes laughed at those who were ashamed of what was natural and at the same time worshipped what was artificial, luxurious clothes, golden cups, ostentatious philosophy. He lived as if he wanted to remind people that humans are no different from animals in their needs, they are different only in that they have invented rules for themselves to be ashamed of their own nature. And it was this simplicity that was the most frightening challenge for the Athenians. Diogenes did not just live differently. He turned his existence into a constant experiment. How far can you go to show the absurdity of the rules by which society lives? Once he was carrying a clay bowl in his hand. But he saw a boy drinking water straight from his palm. Diogenes stopped, laughed, threw the bowl on the ground, and smashed it. Even a child is simpler than me. He learned from the smallest example, proving that people ruin their lives by inventing necessary things. He liked to attack even philosophers. Most of all, Plato. Once, Diogenes entered his house, saw a luxurious carpet, and began to trample on it with his feet. Here I am trampling on your pride. Plato replied that he trampled on pride with even greater pride. But for the Athenians, this episode became a spectacle, a public challenge to Socrates' own disciple. Another incident shocked Athens even more. He even demonstratively relieved himself in the square, to show that people had invented shame for themselves. He responded calmly to the shouts and indignation. If hunger could be satisfied so easily, the world would be simpler. This was his way of showing the gap between the words and deeds of the Athenians. Those who proclaimed virtue lived in luxury and debauchery themselves. His most famous challenge was the lantern in broad daylight. He walked the streets and declared, "I am looking for an honest person." Another time, he ran around the agora with a broken piece of herring in his hands. People laughed and wondered, and he shouted, "This is all you need to live. Everything else is just unnecessary things that make you slaves." It wasn't just eccentricity. It was a public insult to an entire city that prided itself on democracy and wisdom. After all, in the crowd, among hundreds of citizens, he showed that honesty is harder to find than darkness on a sunny day. Thus, Diogenes became a mirror in which the Athenians saw themselves without embellishment. And the more he shocked them, the louder his philosophy resounded. Truth does not need gold, but it always stings the eyes. His fame spread far beyond Athens. And when a young king who dreamed of conquering the world came to Greece, he also wanted to see the eccentric philosopher. Alexander the Great, victor of battles and beloved of the army, approached Diogenes, who was sitting by his barrel, basking in the sun. A crowd gathered around. Everyone waited. What would the king say, and how would the philosopher respond? Alexander said, "Ask me for anything. I can give you everything." Silence. Then Diogenes looked up and replied, "Yes. Move away. You are blocking my sun." The people gasped. In a world where even kings bowed their heads to Alexander, this poor man allowed himself to push him away as if he were a passerby. Alexander smiled. And he said the famous phrase that has been repeated for centuries. If I were not Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes. The contrast was obvious. One ruled armies and cities, the other had nothing but freedom. But at that moment, it became clear to everyone which of them was truly freer. For Alexander's power depended on spears and the loyalty of his soldiers. Diogenes' freedom depended only on himself. For some, Diogenes forever remained a madman who ruined his life in a barrel. For others, he became the only honest philosopher among all philosophers. It is thanks to him that we have the term cynicism, from the Greek kainos, meaning dog. He really did live like a dog, without shame, without embellishment. But at the same time, he turned out to be more honest than most people. His life was a protest that did not require books or treatises. He taught not with words, but with his own existence: reject everything superfluous, and you will become free. Later, his ideas were taken up by the Stoics. Seneca and Marcus Aurelius no longer lived in barrels, but many of their ideas grew out of this radical cynicism, the rejection of illusions, indifference to wealth, and the search for inner freedom. Interestingly, it was Diogenes who laid the foundations for several principles that later became the core of Stoicism: indifference to wealth, living in accordance with nature, and the search for inner freedom. If Plato built an ideal state on paper, Diogenes showed that true freedom is possible even without a state. Diogenes even turned death into a lesson. When asked how he wanted to be buried, he replied, "Throw my body to the dogs. Let it be of more use." It sounded cruel, but there was logic in it. After death, the body is worthless, and all our rituals are just another illusion. So he left the world the same way he lived in it, with defiance and laughter. More than 2 millennia have passed. But when we look at the world today, something strangely familiar appears before our eyes. In the 21st century, we talk about minimalism, rejecting the system, living beyond consumerism. People seek freedom in rejecting material things and question the power of corporations and states. We call it a trend, write hashtags, and shoot videos. But Diogenes did this 2,300 years ago. Without cameras. Without an audience on social media. His likes were the mockery of the crowd, his virality was the rumors that spread throughout Athens. He showed that the most frightening thing for an empire is not an army of foreigners, but one man who laughs at its rules. Because an army can be defeated with a sword. But laughter cannot be destroyed. And that is why Diogenes' story sounds so poignant today. He reminds us that freedom does not begin when you acquire new things, but when you cease to be their slave. Every era has its Diogenes. The question is whether we are ready to listen to their laughter. And now the question for us: would we have the courage to give up the things that keep us in a cage? Would we laugh at such a madman, as the Athenians laughed at Diogenes?